Thank you very much for, first of all, organizing the event today, and thank you for joining, and thank you for supporting Ukraine. Perhaps before I will start screen sharing and we'll move straight to the presentation about the environmental and climate and related consequences of Russia's full-scale invasion. I probably would like to say a few words about the point in history where we are today. This week, Ukraine's ex-commander-in-chief Valery Zaluzhny said that according to what he sees, we are already in the Third World War, and that is started in 2024. Because it's not only Russia that Ukraine is facing at the moment, but also the North Korean troops and Iranian drones flying on our heads every day. And of course, the other countries which formed, in a way, the informal coalition, but at the same time, it's been public already who is fighting us at this very moment. So with this, I will start talking about different aspects of what we have lived through. It's sort of the third year of this war. The prospects are questionable and perhaps grim, but we will see where we are, in the coming months and in the next year. But I think it's just worth understanding the scale of the challenges that Ukraine is facing at this moment. And I think it's hard to comprehend, even for us, what is actually happening. Now I'm sharing the screen and will tell you a few words about the topic of today's discussion. So we'll be talking about environmental consequences, but first I would like to give you an overview of the overall damages, because everything is linked. Then tell a bit more about environmental and climate consequences of Russian invasion. And then we'll move on to talk about reconstruction of Ukraine. So the overall damage assessment, here's just some numbers. But I'm usually showing these numbers to give you idea of the scale of destruction. Since the very beginning, and some of the largest destruction that happened was in fact in the beginning of the invasion in 22, when a European Investment Bank estimated back then the need of Ukraine to rebuild at more than $1 trillion US. And then, of course, the estimates were made more precise, but whatever estimates we have at the moment, we have to keep in mind that we don't have access to lots of territories which are currently under occupation in the front zone and so on. And it's really actually complicated to understand what is going on. When we talk about, for example, environmental consequences right in the front lines, it's so many things. Sorry, do you hear me? I just have I hope it works. So
Yes.
yeah, so when we talk about the environmental consequences at the front zone, for example, there is Donetsk and Lugansk regions are industrial regions with lots of coal mines, and so there is lots of coal mines that are being flooded, and that means that toxic waters are coming up, and we already saw some of these consequences since 2014. But even then, Ukraine really could not estimate, the exact damage, because we couldn't access those territories, and now it's getting just worse because lots of coal mines are being flooded at this very moment, and also because Russia is abandoning all of those coal regions and the coal mines that have not been closed properly since 2014, even at the territories that they are controlling and have been controlling. So it's a very big environmental catastrophe by itself in Donbass that they claim to be protecting. So people have been leaving, the industries are shutting down, and plus all of these other consequences. And environment, when I talk about environment, of course, it has direct impact always on the people, because the water has been polluted, soil has been polluted, and so on. So I will show you some pictures. Today I'll be showing a lot of graphs and photos to give you an idea of what is going on. When we talk about the direct damages, so something we can assess somehow, it's more than 150 billion. So it's damages to infrastructure when you can try to calculate. The latest estimates for up to 2 years of full-scale invasion done by the Kiev School of Economics, and there is World Bank estimates. But in any case, we are talking about hundreds of billions of dollars worth of recovery and reconstruction efforts. This is something that Ukraine would never be able to do by itself. And of course, now we are especially in a dire situation when we don't have enough money to replenish our budget because we have our own needs. So among those numbers that I also wanted to mention is the environmental damage. So the Ministry of Environment and the Environmental Inspectorate, they are also estimating the damages done to the environment and trying to put a price tag on that. And Ecoaction, together with the International Initiative on Greenhouse Accounting of War, is also trying to estimate for the first time in history climate damage from the war that is going on today. The most recent assessment showed that if we also try to put a price tag on this climate damage, we're talking about more than 30 billion US dollars of damage, worth of damage. Here it's other numbers, but also to bring you the perspective, because dollars is of course a nice kind of mark, but what does it tell us? When you look at the housing that has been destroyed, residential buildings, private and multi-storied, it's hundreds of thousands of buildings that have been destroyed by Russia since 24th of February 2022. Thousands of educational institutions that have been always a primary target, healthcare institutions, and so on. So it's very often social infrastructure that has been targeted. And that has been destroyed. If you go to a city like Mykolaiv, you will see that each kindergarten, school, hospital is either damaged or destroyed. And also public infrastructure, and of course, energy infrastructure too. I will not be talking too much about it, but I think you've heard and you probably know that more than half of our energy infrastructure has been also damaged or destroyed at this moment. What is important also is to remember where the damage is taking place. Of course, it's very close to the front lines, where Russia can reach with their artillery, and places like Kharkiv, where I was born, is been badly damaged. It's used to be a city of more than 1 million people residents, but there is still a lot of people living there, of course. And many others all along the front line. You can see, of course, in the north, since the beginning of full-scale invasion, there was also lots of destruction.
Yeah.
And there is now lots of other weapons that Russia is using that, of course, can reach the west of Ukraine with horrifying consequences too, such as recently in Lviv, when a whole family died and so on. But when we talk and take it in a larger picture, Ukraine is really split into the regions that are closer to the front line, and of course damages that are much worse, and the West. That also has an impact on when we're talking about recovery and reconstruction, and this is why we talk about it. Different regions have different needs. Of course, you can imagine that lots of people have moved from the east toward the west, and that means that the western regions of Ukraine, for them, recovery is about accommodating all of these people and changing the economy locally, so that people could be living together with all of the internally displaced persons who are moving in tens of thousands. Just yesterday, I was at an event where we were discussing the current, and actually Andriy also was there. So we were discussing about what the coal regions of Ukraine are living through today in the east and in the west. We have coal regions in Donbass and also in the western regions of Ukraine. And there, of course, the prospects are very different. And the Western core regions, what they are worrying about, even though they have not been targeted for the moment, so they are kind of saying that we are very lucky that we have not still been targeted. But they have tens of thousands of internally displaced persons who are moving through these cities all the time, and they have to find ways to accommodate them and so on. So this is just to say that challenges are very different. Somewhere you have to have emergency reconstruction so that to make sure that people are somehow surviving, and somewhere like in other regions it's more about other issues. Sorry, just a second. So moving to environmental consequences. There's been a plenty, and we witnessed so much since 22. Of course, some of the first images were the Russia targeting the Ukrainian oil depots. So you can see the firemen trying to fight the fire at the oil depots with this very black fumes. This is how it looks like. And back then we already understood with colleagues that there is really something that has to be done, because it looked like the it looked just really bad. Then we also saw possible soil pollution when we saw so much Russian equipment being abandoned, but also the mining, meaning using the landmines. The Russians left lots of landmines all over the place, wherever they were. And every time that you try to clear the landmines, sometimes it can be done in a way that also harms the environment and so on. So there could be pollution with heavy metals and so on. So air pollution, soil pollution, our forests, which have been just burned. And then, of course, the most marking, the most, the largest scale event that happened was Russians blowing up the Kakhovka Dam in summer 2023. And just that event, the estimated damages are at the level of a few billion US dollars. And it was horrible. So it's not just because of course the houses were flooded. Most likely some people didn't survive, and we actually don't have the numbers because some people were in the occupied territories and we don't know what happened there. But also lots of species just died out in a few days. Natural parks were flooded. Lots of pollution because there was lots of industrial zones, so they were flooded, and it means that lots of pollution just moved toward the Black Sea. So the consequences will have to be studied for decades. It's really, this is something that can be called an ecocide, because it was a targeted destruction of the kind of infrastructure that should never be targeted, even during the wartime. And also you can see the solar panels here. And this is because I want to tell a few words about the impact on climate. Before 2022, Ukraine has been progressing a lot in energy transition. We had more and more renewables in our grid. And these systems also became the target. Some of them are in their occupation. And it also, of course, has an impact on our energy mix at the moment, and on the availability of also the cleaner energy that we can use today. And then a few more words about climate. So now we have COP29 happening in Baku in Azerbaijan, and these are our Ukrainian colleagues there, who try to make sure that we talk about what is happening, and that this war is financed by fossil fuels. So this is not just something that is far away, from also climate discussions, but in fact it has a kind of very direct link. Fossil fuels will be killing us, are already killing us through climate change, but also because Russia has been financing this war by fossil fuel exports to other countries. And you can see that they have earned hundreds and hundreds of billions since the 24th of February 22 by their exports of fossil fuels. And even today, even though there is sanctions by mostly, of course, Western countries, nevertheless, lots of them are still buying Russian LNG. Russia has the shadow fleet, but perhaps Simon can also say a few words about that. So in any case, my message here is that we are still keep funding this war, while countries do help Ukraine the way they can, but the same countries are also still funding Russia to be killing more Ukrainians. This is what it is. And a few words about the climate impact of the war itself. So I mentioned the initiative on greenhouse gas accounting of war. And according to the latest assessment that was released this summer, after 2 years of war, the emissions caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine are more than the annual emissions of a country like the Netherlands. So just to give you a comparison point. And this is how these emissions have been growing. And when we talk about the climate emissions, greenhouse gas emissions or climate aspects of the war, what does this include? This includes the emissions from the warfare itself, from the fighting, but also other things like land fires, also the change in routes of civil aviation, because many countries are not flying over Russia or over Ukraine anymore, so they have to do the detour, so that contributes to more greenhouse gas emissions. Also movement of Ukrainian refugees who escaped in millions also was calculated here and so on. But then you can see that 32% of all of the greenhouse gas emissions are from reconstruction, so from the necessity to rebuild Ukraine. So almost 1/3 of all of these emissions related to this war are about how we will be rebuilding. And that's why we have an opportunity to build back better, exploring different aspects of how to rebuild. I want to say that reconstruction is happening already today. And while we have been thinking about it since basically Russians were kicked out of the north of Ukraine, people started rebuilding very quickly. So already in spring 22, we started conversations about how to rebuild, how to do it better. And you can check the website, buildukrainebackbetter.org, where we've been gathering with the NGOs different information about how we can do it better, more sustainably, greener. You can find different materials, events. Do take part if you're interested. This is a website that shows what more than 50 different organizations are doing on this aspect, on building back better. But I will show you a few things on that, what has been happening. So what we've defined back in spring 22 with more than 50 Ukrainian organizations, what a green reconstruction from our perspective would mean. And these are just some of the most important points. Following, the European Green Deal priorities, moving toward Europe and integrating climate and environmental policies into all sectors. We thought it was important to mention that reconstruction should serve the needs of Ukrainians, because of course, and now we hear some countries like also the US mentioning that big interest in Ukraine's critical minerals, for example. But what does it mean for Ukraine? Would it serve the needs of Ukrainians if we will start exporting lots of critical minerals? Development of the green economy is also one of the important principles as such. So looking at Ukraine in general, what we can do, what we can produce when we move toward the green economy. I will not be going through all of these points. I think it's a lot to say about everything. But maybe one thing that became important in practical terms, especially in practical terms, is the role of local governments. Because the reconstruction in the end is happening locally, on the local level. And when we talk about green recovery projects, they're really happening very often at the local level. And I will show you these examples, what it actually means. These were the principles that we called first, and back then in spring 22, post-war green recovery principles. But then the reality, again, as I mentioned, is like that we actually rebuild in already today, and we don't know how long the war lasts. So it's more about the wartime reconstruction for the moment. This is just one of the examples of the quick reconstruction. This is the famous bridge in Irpin that was destroyed to not let Russian troops to enter Kiev. And there were lots of people hiding under the bridge, if you remember images from 22. So then when Russians retreated, you can already see how very quickly Ukraine moved in with constructing the new bridge just over the old one, or near the old one, sorry. And of course, did we care about making it better for the environment when we were quickly rebuilding the bridge, the road? Absolutely not. That was not the priority. And this is the issue: is that do we rebuild quick or do we rebuild longer? But we take into consideration other things. And of course, during the wartime, very often you have to rebuild quicker. Just some of the challenges. And I'll be here, I think I will be just last of my slides are just pictures and challenges. So I just want to say a few words about what we are facing when we're rebuilding during the war, and when we are talking about building back better, how do these overlap? You can see also one of the buildings in Hostomel that was before and after, so that was already rebuilt. And again, people tried to rebuild as much as quickly as they could because they wanted to return home. And to do that, they just gathered their own money, whatever they had. And then the city helped a lot, and then they find some donors who also helped a bit. And then they just tried to get whatever financing was there, but first they started with themselves. And this is just to be able to come back home. The resources are in the end super limited for any reconstruction needs. Ukraine needs a lot, and as I showed in the very beginning, and people also, as you imagine, also don't earn enough to be able to actually rebuild in their own homes after this kind of damages. So resources is a very big challenge. The available resources. Also the capacity, who will be rebuilding? If we want to rebuild back better, I don't know, with better technologies, better energy efficiency, we need people, we need hands, we need this human capacity, we need planners on the ground who be able to do that. And most of the times, some people, we just don't have enough because some people left the country. For example, energy managers of the cities left. We don't have enough builders. Lots of men have been mobilized. And it just, you cannot also teach very quickly personnel and so on. So we just don't have enough people for the moment. Then this challenge about building back or building better. And here is, it's not just a field. This is something that used to be the reservoir of the Kakhovka Dam, just over it, that was filled with water, and that served served as a water resource to have the hydropower plant running, and also for the feeding the agriculture areas in the south. Now this is what it looks like. This is a forest. This is a big young forest. And environmentalists are just saying this is incredible what is happening, how it looks like. It's a huge, huge forest, one of the largest in Eastern Europe. And it separates now Ukrainians and occupied territories by Russians. Now Ukrainian government is saying that they want to fully rebuild the dam. Or fully or not fully, they say we will be rebuilding the dam, because by inertia, you always say we want to build back whatever you had. You had your home, you want to build it back. You had you have a road, you want to build it back. We had this energy infrastructure, we want to have it back. And there is kind of no time to think, to discuss, to do some assessments, to evaluate different options. And that's why there is many other people at the same time saying, hey, are you sure you want to rebuild the dam again? Environmentalists are saying that there will be another ecocide if we decide to rebuild the dam again, because it's a huge construction that will last for more than 10 years probably. And it's very questionable what will be the outcomes of that. Do we really want? And for me, this is I think it will be the most important project. If we decide, the question, would we build it back or not, would actually show, is Ukraine ready to build back better? And finally, this is the last thing I want to show. So I promised to show how the green reconstruction looks like on the ground. What is important for Ukrainians, as you may imagine, is the availability of energy resources. So now we have more and more projects, and very often they're driven by NGOs and people locally, having more autonomous energy generation, because our energy system it became a target because it used to be and still is highly centralized. So now we see the value of decentralizing the energy system, and Ukrainians see the value to be able to produce energy locally because you can then regulate it better. And of course, renewables is one of the options that became important this moment with some storage. So we see more and more projects like this happening, but the needs are very big. The needs are in hundreds and thousands, and for now, it's very hard to scale this up because of also the financial aspects. Yeah, so this is my last slide on that, but I'll show you what is actually important, what is happening, and the green reconstruction now looks like more like this. Perhaps there is a few also some interesting pilots with the use of, I don't know, wood in reconstruction and so on, but I think it's still not the large scale. What we need today is something very practical like this. This is what many organizations are working on. Yeah, so you can find this information if you would need to access this slides again. I will drop it also in the chat. And don't hesitate to let me know if you have any other questions. Thank you. And I'll stop sharing. Oh, yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. What an amazing presentation. And I think the recording will be an amazing resource for people. Really appreciate it. And our next speaker is Andriy Andrusevych, who is a senior policy expert at Resource and Analysis Center of Society and Environment, which is an environmental think tank organization in Ukraine. He's also a vice president and board member of the European Environmental Bureau, the largest network of environmental citizens organizations in Europe. So thanks, Andriy. You're next.
Thank you. And first of all, thanks for your interest in joining this webinar to learn about the environmental dimension of the Russian aggression. I don't have a presentation. My understanding is that you have all different professional interests, and I think the best thing for me would be to give a short description of how we see the context and what we do, and then maybe to answer more specific questions if you have any. I'll start by saying that I'm very lucky that I have my heating and electricity back. As we are approaching the cold season, we are now again in regular outages. So just the last 3 hours, we had no water, electricity, and heating, but it's back already, and I'm very happy, and my family is happy. Now, and I live in a very western part of Ukraine. I don't live near the front line at all. Now, I would like to share the two major areas that we work now on as an environmental think tank. And most of these areas are directly related to the war. The first one is green reconstruction, something that Anna has just slightly addressed. And the second is the EU accession process. These two processes, they are very important. These are the two key processes that the country is going through. And they are very closely, I mean, the war and the EU accession. And the EU accession is also extremely important for the reconstruction. Anna just mentioned that we will never find the money necessary to rebuild the country. I think we we will rebuild the country. It's not only a question of money. It's a question of the security and political environment that the country will be in after the war. And that will define whether we will be able or not to rebuild the country. And this is why the EU accession is so important, because it will bring the necessary economic, regulatory, and security environment that will enable the country to rebuild itself. But I will go back to the first area that we worked on, and just to describe the context and what kind of policy challenges we have. Clearly the direct environmental impacts of the war are just huge. The infrastructure, social infrastructure impact, immense. I mean, it's hard to describe, and no numbers can explain, or I think sufficiently shed sufficient light, let's say, on the scale of this destruction. Anna is very correct in saying that the reconstruction is going every day, to some extent. And that's, I think, is the biggest challenge. Imagine you are, I don't know, you are wounded and running away from a danger on the street. And at the same time, there are many voices telling you, oh, but you need to plan it. You need to plan your route, plan it better. You know, consider this, consider that. But you are just running away. And this is what's going on. I mean, every day we have huge, immense, immediate needs that needs to be addressed. Children need to go to school. People need to be able to see a doctor. People should be able to use the road to deliver goods, to deliver passengers. The country needs energy, whether you want it or not. I mean, before this full-scale aggression started, from the movies and everything, we had this impression then. And then when you have such a war, I mean, a scale of a world war, I mean, it's really a huge scale. The whole country will be, I don't know, working on military plans or something, but this is not the case. People, are living, children are going to school, the doctors are going to hospitals, the drivers are delivering, I don't know, milk, meat, the farmers need to work. I mean, the whole country has to work. And there is no option. I mean, you don't have the option not to work. You have to work for the whole country to operate and for the army to operate. I mean, it's a bizarre, I know you might have seen videos or pictures from the regions, from central regions, from Kyiv, from western regions, where people, you have shops open, you have cafeterias open. That's right, because the country has to live. And energy is one of the core resources on which the country depends. Now, in this situation, of course, whatever is being done is to address the critical needs as quickly as possible. And then, of course, we as an environmental think tank have been from the very beginning, from June 2022, raising and promoting and working on the concept of the green reconstruction. The problem is, it's nice to say build back greener, for example, but how do you actually do it while you are running? That's the biggest challenge that we have right now. We have a new minister now in Ukraine of environment, and she seems to be very keen on launching, let's say, an initiative to enable green reconstruction, even during the wartime. And this is very closely linked to the peace formula of the President Zelensky, which has 10 points, and point 8 is about environmental security, environmental safety, basically about the environment. And it includes the need for the green reconstruction. So under this, let's say, umbrella, it is likely that the government will be now working more intensively on putting in place a real framework which will enable green reconstruction as we go now. I mean, when I say as we go now, that means today. How do we enable that the activities that are taking place today contribute to building a climate neutral economy in the future, a circular economy in the future? The activities, to a large extent, not controlled by the government. Anna just mentioned about the housing. Clearly, most of the houses were repaired by the residents themselves. The electricity outages. Most businesses are buying the generators, usually diesel generators, to provide some backup during the outages. Of course, as a government, you don't control it. So there are many investments and activities, I mean, minor or larger, going on, which you don't control. There are activities that you control, building the roads, rebuilding or building new hospitals or schools. Of course, the citizens, the residents don't do that. So there are things that you as a government control, but there are many things that you don't control. How do you enable streamlining green ideas, green considerations into those processes? Just yesterday, one of our largest businesses and the steel maker made a presentation in Italy saying, oh, we are putting in place a Build Back Better concept by constructing a green steel making facility in Italy, not in Ukraine. Because this is the reality. To make this particular facility, they need electricity. And here, they cannot have any guarantee that they will have they need a lot of electricity. That they will have this, it's a secondary steel production from scrap, so they need electricity. So they are investing outside Ukraine. As a government, how do you control these processes? If they are building the relocation of the enterprises, we have a region in Ukraine which is very, very near the EU. I mean, it's the western southern part near Hungary. It's called Transcarpathian region, which has been never struck by Russian missiles, never. So a lot of, as you can imagine, a lot of enterprises are moving there, I mean hundreds. How do you make sure that the way they do it, the way the land they take, the infrastructure they build, how do you ensure that this is done considering the green considerations, or taking into account the green consideration? So my point is, on a practical level, this is a very serious challenge for policy design. How do you design a policy and put it in place which would not will not disturb the immediate reconstruction processes, but build the foundations for a green future, for a non-fossil fuels future, for energy efficient future, for circular economy future. So and that's what we are working on. That's what exactly for the last 2.5 years, that's what we've been doing. We've been looking for solutions. We've been looking for design for such policies. How do you just, how do you design them? And now I think we have a good time now, giving the priority, because of the priority given to the environmental dimension of the peace formula, that this will be institutionalized by the government. Now, the second, very briefly, the second process, which we consider to be equally important for the country, equally to the war itself, is the EU accession. This is the only process which can ensure a just and long-lasting peace and the context for the recovery. As you may know, in 5 days after the invasion, we have filed the accession application with the EU, which was the EU was taken by surprise, of course. And then and then the whole thing started. We are now, we as an organization have been helping the government from the very first days to go through this, because it's accession is a complicated process, which involves the work of thousands of people. We've been helping them from the very beginning, and we are helping them now by doing different work, by trainings, by policy research, by providing a very specific analysis towards specific EU instruments on environment or climate change, regulations, directives, and by helping to build some or implement some of the key steps in this process. For example, I think it was April 2022, we've been helping the government to fill in the questionnaire, because when we filed the application, in response, the EU gave us a questionnaire. So we helped the government to fill in that questionnaire. It's a long, the result is very long, thousands of pages. But we've been only dealing with environmental, of course, part of that. And I remember very well sitting in a shelter, which is actually a basement of my building, under the whole nights, and filling in this questionnaire, the relevant parts that I was responsible for. Now, the government is preparing for the screening sessions, which means the outcomes of which will define whether we will open negotiations on Chapter 27. The whole accession process is divided into 35 negotiating chapters, and 27 is climate and environment, climate change and environment. So we are now there, and we are, as much as we can, helping the government to prepare for the screening sessions, which we hope will take place in June next year. So this is very briefly of what we do and why these of the two issues are important, as I see it, and related to each other. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andriy. That was really useful information, I think, and thank you very much. Really appreciate your talk. Now, next is Simon Pirani, who has been writing about Ukraine's energy sector and more widely about Ukrainian and Russian society and politics for more than 30 years, and also writes about fossil fuels and energy systems. And he is the author of Change in Putin's Russia, Power, Money, and People, and Burning Up: A Global History of Fossil Fuel Consumption. He also writes a blog at peoplenature.org, and I can put that in the chat, and is an honorary professor at the University of Durham.
So thank you, Marianne, for the invitation to speak and the welcome. Anna mentioned sanctions. I don't have anything prepared to speak about that. Of course, it's a huge issue. My view is that the United States and the other Western powers were always prepared to impose sanctions as long as the price of oil didn't exceed $60 a barrel. That was a kind of limit for them. They were very explicit about that in the talks in December 2022. The fact they've just sanctioned Gazprom Bank, through which all the earnings, or many of the earnings for Russia's oil and gas exports go after nearly 3 years, should lead us all to ask the question, why didn't they sanction Gazprom Bank before this, and we should. I would also draw your attention to an excellent piece of research by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists has just appeared today about the shady methods, the bribery, and all the rest of it used by the international oil companies to get their Kazakh oil through Russia in the Caspian pipeline, and a terrific piece of investigation. And of course, a lot of journalists, NGOs have been working on this, and it is a terrible story. We can talk about it more if people have questions, but I'm not going to address it further. I'm going to talk mainly about post-war reconstruction, but I completely agree with the previous two speakers that it is pointless to talk about reconstruction separately from the fact of where we are in the war. And in particular, if we're talking about the energy system, which is what I'm going to talk about, these attacks on the power stations. Anna's talked about the attack on the Kakhovka Dam, but of course, most of the large coal and gas-fired power stations in Ukraine and the combined heat and power plants have been destroyed by bombing, first of all in the spring of this year, and then a completely gratuitous war crime committed as some sort of ghoulish celebration of the American election result the other day, when further power stations were put out of action. And in response to that, of course, I think the dynamic that Andriy has talked about of, how do you rebuild while running at the same time is very live. And there's been a massive uptake of diesel generators, batteries, solar panels, and all this equipment to help people survive the blackouts at household level. I know that's been a big issue for civil society in Europe. People have tried to help. So we have to take these timescales together. So moving on to the post-war reconstruction, again, I agree with Anna. It's not post-war. It starts now. I think we have to have that conversation because decisions are being taken. And when Anna poses these sort of dilemmas, building back or building better, centralized or decentralized, immediate or long term, I think we have to bear in mind all of those things. And I suppose really what I'm going to speak about is mostly decisions that are at government level. And I think it would be very easy and very pointless to kind of paint a picture of what I think would be the ideal policy. But I think what we can say in answer to the questions raised by Anna and Andriy about the reconstruction, there are things we should do. There are roads we should advocate the government goes down and the civil society goes down, and there are things we should not do. So I'm going to try and put things into those different categories. I think as well that we have to think about the way that decisions are taken. So before this call, I tried to look at all the mountain of documents that we get from the Ukrainian government, the European Commission, and others about post-war reconstruction. And of course, these documents only tell a very small part of the story, because all these documents essentially are drawn up on the understanding that the state's role is to facilitate private capital, and that private capital needs to play the leading role. And the result is that many decisions are in practice taken by companies in line with their short-term or medium-term economic interests, and government decisions are actually subordinated to those. That's what actually happens. And the example that Andriy gave of DTEC deciding to invest in so-called green steel in Italy is an excellent one. And it shows the sort of problems that we're dealing with. And of course, this is not a Ukrainian issue. This happens in essentially in all capitalist countries. And despite the decades of experience that has shown us that giving this initiative to private capital when providing a service such as energy, the electricity, the heat, the other essentials that people rely on, that putting these services in private hands is the worst way. Nevertheless, that's what often happens. So I'm going to talk about technologies, and I'm going to talk about forms of ownership. and I'll try. It does roughly fall into ones that I think are good and ones that I think are bad. So I'll try and say why. So on technologies, perhaps the most important group of technologies for the energy reconstruction are energy conservation technologies. And I think these can be embraced from now. That is on the understanding that, while the war is still in progress, to serve Ukraine's energy needs, those technologies that conserve energy, so make it possible to use less of it, are good. And Ukraine has urban infrastructure, housing stock, and industry built in the Soviet period, very often on the basis of cheap supply of gas from Russia. So the whole, all these district heating systems, all the boilers in the blocks and so on, it was built on the assumption that this cheap gas from Russia would be there forever. And millions of Ukrainians, even before the invasion, lived in houses that were badly insulated. And of course, now the situation's much worse with the widespread destruction that Anna described to us. And the investment of relatively small sums of money in insulation and heat pumps could go a long way to reducing the amount of gas, coal, and electricity that's actually needed. And that was true actually long before the Russian invasion. As far as I can see from the documents from the most recent Warsaw Reconstruction Conference, the government appears to have almost forgotten about this issue. In 2022, in the first version of the post-war reconstruction plan, the government had these very large sums of money, which they were very speculative. I don't think anybody thought that even in the most optimistic scenario that the Western governments would come up with this money, but they listed the sort of money that's needed, a bit like Anna's first slide. 50 billion was there for residential energy efficiency, energy conservation, $50 billion, $11 billion for district heating, and $19 billion for heat pumps. Now, in the documents for the Warsaw event, Ukraine has presented an investment plan, so it's not the same as the 2022 document. But I think if you look at that investment plan, you look at the energy items that are mentioned as a list of priority energy projects, which adds up to about $10 billion. And out of that, under 2%, $125 million is labeled for energy efficiency via the State Fund for Decarbonization and Energy Transformation. And I think that's just a change of mindset in Ukraine, in the government, that I'm sure our friends in the NGOs are trying to shift, and they need all the help they can get from us outside. That document also has a big section on urban infrastructure and housing, and that says nothing about making sure that buildings can be heated and lit with minimal energy use, which with modern construction techniques is completely easy, but you have to regulate the property companies and the construction companies, and there's nothing about that there. So that issue needs to be highlighted. And just taking up Anna's point that she's put in the chat about she's responded to my point about Ukraine relying on cheap Russian gas. She's absolutely right. Ukraine was producing a lot of its own coal, particularly in Donetsk, and gas in the 20th century. And in fact, Ukraine was the heart of the original Soviet gas industry. And then the production only moved up to Siberia in the 1960s and 70s. So, I mean, absolutely agree. But still, I think time has moved on. I mean, I'll jump actually and say, what about oil and gas? That's another set of technologies, and Ukraine's actually has had great success since 2014 in reducing imports of gas, and Ukraine stopped importing any Russian gas in 2016, and has indeed since then relied on its own gas, to which Anna has mentioned in the chat. I don't agree with the emphasis being put by the government in these reconstruction documents on expanding gas production with a view to export. I mean, I can say why and answer questions, but I mean, I don't think that should be a priority. So moving on to a technology that I absolutely do think should be a priority is renewables. Ukraine had some success. This has already been mentioned before the Russian invasion in building wind and solar. In 2021, it was 14% of Ukrainian electricity generation capacity, plus 11% from hydro. Now, since the Russian invasion, some of that's been damaged, but renewables capacity has actually continued to expand, especially because of the decentralized efforts that have already been referred to. Solar panels, small-scale wind, biomass boilers, and these are all, of course, harder to bomb than larger power stations. There are articles by a couple of teams of Ukrainian researchers, I'll try and find them, put them in the chat later, which have argued that the energy system should be based on renewables in future, the post-war system. And I think this is very, very important. I see another policy paper on the Build Ukraine Back Better site, which says very similar things about basing reconstruction on renewables. So I think this is a technology which is good. It's good in all circumstances and it's good at all levels. The government's investment plan does include wind and solar projects, but they're mostly projects from those big corporations. I would like to see more support for the municipal and small scale projects that we've heard about on this call. Let's advocate for that. Now, another technology, and this is in my view, a bad one, not because we don't need it, but because we don't need to prioritize it now, is hydrogen. And this is a major problem with the government proposals, is that they're proposing that renewable electricity should be used in quite large quantities to produce hydrogen for export. They claim this hydrogen can be exported to Europe through the pipelines previously used for gas. And I just tell you that any pipeline engineer will look at you with a big question mark in their eyes if you say that. It's not so easy from an engineering point of view. But I think these plans should be opposed by civil society. I'll explain why. I think that, so basically what the government is proposing is that renewable electricity will be produced, then hydrogen will be made through so-called green hydrogen from electrolyzing water. So you pass large quantities of electricity through large quantities of water, and that's where you get your hydrogen. It is fossil fuel free, that is true, but it's a very energy intensive process. So if you opt for using your renewable electricity to make hydrogen to export to the European Union, you are deciding effectively, practically, in reality, not to use that renewable electricity to put it into the grid, to put coal and gas off the grid. And I think that is a mistake. Either you insulate Ukrainian homes and use the renewable electricity to power heat pumps to provide additional warmth, or use the renewable electricity to make hydrogen, export that hydrogen to, let's say, Austria, and use it to heat homes there. Now, very rough calculation, you would heat about a quarter of the homes by doing that export of hydrogen to Austria than you could by keeping the renewable electricity at home and using it for heat pumps and insulating homes. There are elements of current reconstruction policies that lead in that direction. I mean, it may all go nowhere because it's so expensive and so energy intensive, but the idea of exporting hydrogen is in line with EU energy policies, and I think has a streak of neo-colonialism in it, a bit like the idea of exporting critical minerals, which has been already mentioned. Okay, so the final technology is nuclear. And this year, due to the attacks, the bombing of coal and gas-fired power stations, more than half of Ukraine's electricity is being supplied from nuclear. So there's no immediate prospect of moving away from it. But I think in the medium and long term, the labor movement and civil society should favor moving away from nuclear, which is always expensive and always closely tied to the military in all countries. Now, the research by Ukrainian academics is clear here too. It's a recent paper by Ukrainian researchers in energy policy. It's the big, it says it on the tin. It says that's the name of the journal. It's the main academic journal in the energy policy field. And they forecast that nuclear power will decline in the next 30 years in Ukraine, whatever happens, because of the huge cost of generating electricity from nuclear compared to generating it from renewables. But there are forces that are pushing in the opposite direction. So we have an energy minister who has a background in the nuclear industry, and he's been talking with American nuclear corporations. They've agreed to build the 2 new units at the Khmelnytsky power station, and at the talks in Baku, a memorandum was signed by Ukrenergoatom and some of the American corporations, which talked about launching a program of building small modular reactors. Now, like many of the technologies that we hear from corporations and governments claiming to tackle climate change, these small modular reactors may never work and will certainly be very expensive, like many technologies for which energy companies get vast subsidies from state budgets. So to sum up, I think the labor movement and civil society should favor energy conservation, favor electricity generation from renewables, especially decentralized renewables, and these should be favored over fossil fuels, over nuclear, and over false solutions such as hydrogen. Now, just to say a few words about principles of ownership. I think the situation Ukraine is in brings home the importance of public and social forms of ownership of energy resources. Take the pressing problem of how much ordinary citizens pay for electricity, gas, and other energy supplies. These tariffs, so before the Russian invasion, these tariffs were held down by governments in Ukraine who were fearful of popular anger, and tariffs are actually quite low by European standards. Any increase in tariffs will penalize the poorest families in Ukraine who are already suffering terrible hardship in wartime. Despite this, there are policy proposals from the government and from the international financial institutions, all for price liberalization. Now, if there is an element of public ownership in the energy sector, public bodies can raise funds from general taxation and use them to supply the electricity, gas, and so on that people need at reasonable rates. All over Europe, neoliberal policies have failed in providing public services. I mean, I'm speaking to you from a country where the water companies pour sewage into the water supply with absolutely no let or hindrance because of the unregulated use of private capital in the water sector, which, I mean, our neighbors in Europe and even from Ukraine are always shocked when you tell them about this. These policies have failed. They failed in the energy sector in many respects, as we saw in 2022 when all the prices went up. And I think the idea of public services and public ownership and public provision can really take on a new 21st century meaning in the course of Reconstruction. And I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Simon. That was really informative, and I really appreciate that. I'm going to stop the recording.